Hello, everyone. This is June 12th. It's the SIG Azure meeting, bi-weekly meeting. This is a meeting that is recorded and on the internet, so please be mindful of what you say. Please adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which essentially amounts to don't be a jerk, right? So we don't have, so I want to give an opportunity to people who haven't been on the call to introduce themselves first and foremost, and then we can walk through our one-item agenda. Okay, cool. Everyone's been here before?
Sorry, I saw Chris on mute, so I thought he was gonna. So I'm Tim Farrow. Uh, I'd say I work at Microsoft and I do AKS stuff as well as Azure DevOps and a few other things. So happy to join.
Awesome. Welcome. And Chris? All right. Okay. All right. All right. So what we wanted to do is, yeah, Chris, I think you're you're not muted, but your mic might be busted. So last week, was it last week? I think it was last week. Last week I had a visit at Microsoft with Craig and Rita to talk about some of the things that we are trying to achieve um, for SIG Azure in the second half of the year. So one, if you have not seen the agenda for this meeting, I'm going to link it, and you can take a moment and just drop your name on there, and then secondarily, we've got the planning doc there, and that's some of the meeting notes that we took. It still has a little bit to go to get cleaned up. I want to walk through the cleanup of the SIG cloud provider consolidation. So one of the biggest things that we'll be working on in the next few cycles is to consolidate SIG Azure under SIG Cloud Provider, right? So as a sub-project of SIG Cloud Provider. So what's going to be involved there is a lot of one, figuring out like the sessions that we're going to do for the next KubeCon. So we're not announcing that this is done until KubeCon San Diego in November. But there are lots of little administrivia things to do, like figuring out meeting cadences and doing Zoom links and changing Slack channels. A lot of that process can start now. So I'm thinking what I'm going to do is put together a Kubernetes project board and start just chunking some of these tasks down. So a lot of them will require kind of admin privileges. So wish I could give some of them out as kind of help wanted tasks, but I think that most of them will have to be tackled by the SIG chairs. So so something that's a little bit better fleshed out is one of the things that we're working on is moving the in-tree cloud provider for Azure out of tree, right? So from Kubernetes slash staging legacy cloud provider slash Azure into Kubernetes. Right now it's Kubernetes cloud provider Azure, but it'll become Kubernetes SIG's cloud provider Azure, right? So the work that's involved in forklifting that code, right? So first and foremost, we're going to update the KEPs that we have. So we have a few open right now. I think cross-region nodes, also availability zones, and the most important one, which is the actual out-of-tree cloud controller manager, right? So updating that for 1.16. So after I clean up this planning doc and start chunking out some of the tasks onto a project board, I'm going to start on updating the KEPs for 1.16. So anyone who is not familiar with the KEP is KEP is a Kubernetes enhancement proposal, and basically those are the the documents that we provide to describe a change that's happening to the ecosystem, right? So that, that doc includes like the motivation for the change, like what we're trying to achieve, what we're not trying to achieve, how we're going to implement it, some of the design details of that change, as well as how we're going to test it and validate that it's something that can be graduated through alpha, beta, and GA stages, right? So if you're curious about the current state of that KEP, let me pull that up. All right, so at any point, if you're curious about the Azure KEPs, here is the link. All right. And the one I'm talking about specifically is that one. All right. So take an opportunity to take a read of that, see what's going on. Kind of, one of the first steps we'll be doing is firming up the documentation. So that effort has already started. Rita has been working diligently on actually getting us like reasonable tests for the cloud provider, both on the in-tree side and the out-of-tree side. Actually, I had a question there, Rita. It's something that I intend to do, or I think that we should do. Being able to do the end-to-end tests in both AKS engine as well as Cluster API Azure. What do you think of that?
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think right now it's just AKS engine because it has more full.
That was the thing, yeah.
Well, more that it supports everything we do today. So feature-wise, I think until Cluster API does similar things, like if we were to test that, it wouldn't cover everything yet, right?
Yeah, for sure. So I know that one of the misses that we have right now is the virtual machine scale sets. So that is, well, it's tricky because maybe we could test it that way.
Well, it's like say like Azure CNI or like different container runtime or like Windows, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of that is just like I think we should do both. That's the quick answer. It's just we can't retire AKS engine until
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
So my thought is that we would kind of do both for a while.
Yeah, for sure. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, and then peel out the things that we need, right?
Yeah.
So if you're curious about end-to-end tests for CAPZ, I'm working on a PR there. I think forcing us to kind of adhere to whatever our definition of conformance is for an Azure cluster in Kubernetes would be, or Kubernetes cluster on Azure would be super useful. So I think first step, these these end-to-end tests kind of like see if we can create a cluster, see if we can create a machine. Still some work to be done there. Also, if anyone is interested in contributing to Cluster API Azure, happy to have more contributors. I think that's we're doing our recruitment run for this kind of stuff right now, as well as I think for me, kind of the requirement when someone submits a PR is like we have some general tests that do linting, does some unit testing, but we don't have an end-to-end test. And as a result of that, if I see a big change land or a change that's a little sketchy, it's something that I have to personally smoke test, right? So I figure to kind of get more time back all around and enable more people to contribute, that the end-to-end test is probably like the next big thing that I have to do on that side. So what else? Get back to the agenda. Right. So in doing some of the CCM work, we need to establish timelines, right? So we're basically going to be working through the 116 to about the 118 time cycle, kind of like end of year and a little beyond. to get some of the stuff done. So what we really need to do is figure out what needs to happen in each cycle. So there are some remaining dependencies that we have around CSI to Azure File, Azure Disk CSI plugins, and then also the credential provider. Rita, do you know a little bit more about that at this point, or?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Apologies.
So from the outside looking in, it looks like the code is ready to forklift, right? So I've moved it from staging cloud provider Azure or whatever it's called into legacy cloud providers. So it's being staged there, but there are some kind of like intangibles that I don't fully understand at this point. Right?
I think as you have outlined in the planning doc, right? I think there's some missing features like the CSI stuff, right? And then credential provider. So let's talk to Ping Fei and Andy to understand, to give us a rough estimate as to when that will be done. And I think that seems to be the last items out there until we can move. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes. So I kind of like issued a PR to like actually move the stuff. And Peng Fei and Andy were like, wait, hold on, there's more stuff to consider. So yeah, I kind of did that as a signaling to say like, okay, let's do this. But yeah, so I'll gather my thoughts and reach out to them because they'll have the best idea of what's going on there.
Yeah, and can you, like, once you know, can you document that plan doc so that everybody knows?
Oh, for sure.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So testing infrastructure, like how are we, I know it looks all done, but I haven't poked around. How do you feel about like where we are with the end-to-end tests?
Yeah, I mean, CCM is fully, like all the conformance tests and all that stuff runs, I think daily, right? And then, so yeah, we have all of that using AKS Engine today. So they're all like integrated with Test Grid.
Okay, and that's running both in tree and out of tree, right?
Yeah, we have both.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. So the last piece there, I think, is the last piece and probably the most important piece, because I think that this is something that allows people to, we're definitely a sub-project that are currently a SIG, but soon to be a sub-project that needs more contributors, right? So I think that, a well-documented manifests of how to get, an Azure cluster running with the cloud provider would be good, right? So there is an active KEP for that. So one, it's part of the out of tree provider KEP. And then there's also, let me link another one. Okay. So there's also this documentation KEP from like top level SIG cloud provider. All right. And that one kind of describes the expectation for documentation for each of the cloud providers. So having an API server manifest, kube controller manager manifest, a kubelet manifest, and same like for the in-tree and out-of-tree providers, and as well as documenting like how we do resource management. So all of the resources associated in the cluster, node objects, service objects, and the labels and annotations attached to those, right? So that is rolled into part of our out-of-tree provider KEP, and I think that is probably, like, to me at least, that's one of the more urgent things. I think the sooner people have better understanding of how to do this and how to do it successfully, that we can get more people on. So I have, I have a few coworkers actually that have been like, their interest has peaked in Cluster API Azure, and it would be nice to point them in both directions. So let's see, what else? All right, so going into Cluster API, I think that we've, so who has heard of Cluster API? I know you have, Rita. What about you and Tim and Chris?
Think my mic's working now?
Yeah, it
You hear?
is.
Oh, beautiful. I haven't. I'll just quick introduce myself too. So I've been working with Kubernetes the last like 6 months and trying to get more involved with the community on it. So I'm kind of here as more of a fly on the wall, but hope to contribute soon enough.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Anything that you are curious about in particular that we can help out with?
Not at this time. I'm really kind of just getting the lay of the land. But
Yeah.
I've watched a few of these old videos from like that were on YouTube. So I'm interested in the how things are moving forward, and this is pretty cool stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Welcome.
So I know, so Tim, you mentioned cluster API to me, I think, on the previous call. So to answer your question, I've heard of it, but that's the extent of it is really what we talked about the last time I was on one of these calls.
Okay, cool. So, so Chris, the cluster API is essentially declarative configuration for Kubernetes within Kubernetes, right? So it's like if, whoa, what is that? Sorry, my phone is Google Assistanting or something. So, you know, it's kind of solving the meta problem. Like if I could take the same way I define different objects and applications within Kubernetes, what if I could do that with what if I could do that for a Kubernetes cluster, right? So being able to have a like a manifest and a controller manager around the cluster object and the machine objects, right? So a cluster is one type of object, and then the machine is the machine lives within the cluster object, right? So it's intrinsically linked to the two. They're intrinsically linked together. So, you know, what we've done is each provider are a large portion of the providers that are in Kubernetes have started working on individual provider implementations of the cluster API. So right now we're at V1 Alpha 1. So what that means is we can expect a lot of things to change. But right now we're pretty stable. Like we've stabilized on 0.1.0 our V1 Alpha 1 of cluster API. And the next step is like figuring out what V1 Alpha 2 looks like, right? So on the Azure side, what we want to do next is make sure that we're building things that people actually care about, right? And people to us are, on the Microsoft side, it's customers, right? People who are consuming AKS engine and AKS overall, and I'm at VMware, and customers matter to me too, right? So I want to make sure that we're kind of pulling in the feedback that we need to make it a successful provider implementation of cluster API, right? So one of the things that has popped up recently is virtual machine scale sets, right? So making sure we have support for that. So that is running. I don't know if you have more details, what's going on internally, Rita?
You mean the work validation work we're doing, or
The VMSS spike?
Yeah. We're working on it. Well, obviously, like we all dying to know when that will be done, but Cecile is the person driving that right now. So
okay, perfect.
And I am. It is literally on my to-do list to review that design thing for the machine. It is really long. But anyway.
Yeah, it's like 26 pages or something like that, and I was like, this is a later thing to read. So this, so for the second part of this is like the bootstrap provider, right? So there is a linked in that second half planning doc for people on the call. There is a proposal for the idea of machine states and pre-boot bootstrapping. The idea being if we can create an API of to describe what a machine should look like, as well as like what states it can be in, whether it's like pre-provisioned or provisioned or doing an update or something like that, right? we can start to have a common way of describing like the dependencies that are required to bootstrap a machine, right? So like right now, the way we bootstrap machines in Cluster API Azure, the initial implementation of it was via a deployment template within Go code, right? So template it out, and then we kind of write the template to ARM and build a machine that way, right? That has been rewritten to use all of the Azure APIs as opposed to just the deployment API, right? So in that, in rewriting that, there's also like a bash script that's templated out in the code, right? Which is kind of silly, right? Which means it's it's extremely brittle. Actually, as I was doing a test a few days back, one of the dependencies failed to pull, and it killed the entire installation, right? So that's that's how brittle. So pushing the dependencies out of the provider specific code and into an API that can describe what they need to be and how they change over time. Also being able to version them, right? So if I'm going to install a Kubernetes 114 cluster, these are the things I need, right? Being able to describe that as an API as opposed to okay, someone has to bump that dependency version within the bash script that lives in the Go code, right? So getting to a more consistent framework for doing that is kind of like one of the next steps for everyone, right? And then finally, there's interest in talking about what it looks like to provision AKS via Cluster API Azure, right? So that's active work that's happening in Microsoft, and more details will be forthcoming as I have them. But the first, the next big thing that we're trying to suss out is VMSS, because that has come up so many times, and I think that it's an obvious win for all of us to figure out. So any questions on that? All
Nope.
right. All right, cool. All right, so finally, as I mentioned, we're moving into consolidation of SIG Azure into SIG Cloud Provider as a sub-project, right? So there are lots of, again, administrivia that we're going to be working on as SIG chairs and SIG technical leads to get this done, right? Figuring out the sessions for KubeCon, making sure that we have like a reasonable meeting cadence so that we can incorporate the technical leads that are in APAC, as well as the users in APAC and potentially EMEA, and cover the US Eastern and Pacific time zones, right? So that's something that we have to figure out. We'll probably end up doing 2 meetings to our one meeting that is skewed time to better accommodate the APAC region. Changing the Zoom links and the Slack channels and all that good stuff, and figuring out how to deliver quarterly updates, and then the really administrative, like changing GitHub labels and migrating projects from migrating projects to the Kubernetes SIGs org, right? Also figuring out like how we test, so we're doing a good job on the testing side, and how we release, right? So we are able to release the project right now, but I think that we've only cut 1 release for the out of tree one. I'm not super concerned there because the out of tree is essentially a vendor of the in-tree provider, right? So that's not a super big deal. Now, I had posted on Twitter because I was like really curious about like what happens when you change a project name, or what happens when you move a Go project into a different org, and
Bad things happen.
bad things happen, right? So I know about the capitalization one because that happened with the big M Microsoft to
Oh my God,
little
don't
M.
get me started.
Yeah, luckily that didn't affect me, right? I was like, Ralph, just tell me when they're going to do the Azure one, right? Because that will break all of the things that I care about. So right now we're good. Talking over some of the stuff, the way we do the imports in Go for Cluster API as well as for Cloud Provider Azure is we use a vanity URL which is currently kates.io slash cluster slash cloud provider Azure, or for the SIG SIG cloud provider is rather cluster API Azure. So cluster API provider Azure is sigs.kates.io slash cluster API provider Azure, right? So because we have those vanity URLs, as it moves from the cloud provider Azure, as it moves from as it moves from the Kubernetes org into the Kubernetes SIGs org, we should see no outage, hopefully, right? The first reason is that the vanity URLs do redirects to the GitHub URLs, right? And the GitHub URL itself, once we change it, as long as we only change it once, GitHub automatically does a redirect of that stuff, right? So I think we're covered across both the import path as well as just generally browsing those links, right? So I actually want to do that as soon as possible. So I'm going to start looking into what it takes to do that. The reason I say as soon as possible is because right now we have the opportunity, while people are not consuming this as frequently, like once we move out of tree, that will be the one thing, right? And anyone who's doing imports will do the imports there, right? So while the code is primarily in tree, I want to take advantage of that and change the names, right? And check for breakages around the repos, right? We also have a tool called Hound, and Hound is a nice little UI to. It's certainly something that you could write crazy regex for, but it's a little better to have a pretty front end for it, right? So Hound is cs.kates.io, and what that allows you to do is you can search any regex across all of the Kubernetes repos that are visible and get an answer, right? So I can search for all of the things that are imports of Cloud Provider Azure or listed in documentation as Cloud Provider Azure and change that to Kubernetes SIGs / Cloud Provider Azure, right? So I think that we're mostly safe, and I think that right now is a good time to try to do that stuff. So as soon as I gather the rest of this proposal together and put together the project board, we can get rolling on that. Any questions? We have a minute left.
I only have one question regarding like the change of time for this call. Maybe not this call, but just to accommodate more people, time zone.
Yeah. So that is, we still need to figure that out. And Craig and I were talking, and we kind of said like, let's not do it until after KubeCon, right? After KubeCon Shanghai.
Oh, okay.
Right? Yeah.
Okay.
So because he's going to be doing some presentations for Azure over there, I want to make sure that we don't confuse anyone by changing meeting times just yet. Make sure they join the channels, and then we can decide, toss out a doodle or toss out a few doodles and figure out if we're doing 2 meeting times, if we're doing 1, and then update the calendar accordingly.
Okay.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you everyone for hanging out. I will catch you in 2 weeks.
Bye.
Later.